you an idea of a couple things. I find it pretty fascinating. The blue is the ocean. This shows the extent with which the ocean went up the East Branch. The red line is where the glacier disappeared. And the mouth of the Wassataquoik didn't dump into the East Branch in the early years. It dumped into the ocean. Because of that, there's quite a bit of rock. The glacier receded at what's been calculated about 245 feet per year. That doesn't mean it was a steady pushback, but what happened, it would go back for a while, stop and move forward, back for a while, move forward. And that also caused a large number of problems. The other thing that happened to this valley were fires. And there were quite a few fires with it. In 1825 was the first major fire in the valley. It was known as the Miramichi Fire. It was the largest fire ever recorded in North America. It started in the ocean in Miramichi, burned across New Brunswick, and was finally stopped by Katahdin. It burned so fast that it burned the ships in Miramichi Harbor. Part of it was the indentured people that were working there came from Ireland mostly, and they were used to no trees, and so when they saw a fire start, they just ignored it. The next fire that comes is in 1884, and part of that was it was the second most destructive fire in the state at the time. Its starting location was in this area right here. It burned 22,000 acres, and it was started by fishermen who built a fire to have some smoke while they were fishing to keep away the insects. The next fire that we run into was the 1903 fire. The 1903 fire only burned for a couple days, but it burned the equivalent of 132 square miles. It started on June 3rd. It was basically done burning on June 5th and completely out with a torrential downpour on June 9th. It started up way up in the Webster area by men working on a pole line that dumped their pipe, the ashes from the pipe on the ground. A fire started. It worked its way down. And by the time it got to South Branch Pond, all things were in perfect match. They had plenty of fuel from blowdowns. They had a narrow valley, and they had tremendous winds that were blowing through. So it swept very quickly and essentially burned what would be the west side of the East Branch Penobscot, all of the monument, and a large part of central and eastern Baxter State Park. So it was really devastating. For the monument, it was good because, in a way today, because it's grown back now, and it has led to some of the diversity that we've had. The last fire that we have was in 1915 in this area, not the last fire, but the last important fire to logging. And really that put an end to logging in the Wassataquoik Valley. What it did is it burned enough trees that when it was compound in the next 2 years with quick spring melts, led tremendous flooding that took out most of the dams in the area. If we look at the road, the access to Wassataquoik came from a couple different directions. In the early years, the direction would be this road right here called the Stacyville Tote Road. In later years, this road that came out of Happy Corner to Lunksoos. Either way, they had to cross the river in one of three places, either the Hunt, or one of the fords, or the ferry. And then they went up what was called the Wassataquoik Tote Road. To run through the roads real quickly, 1838 was when the Stacyville Tote Road came into play. 2 years later, 1842, 41, the Wassataquoik Tote Road. The East Branch Tote Road was 1845. That's the one that goes up along the edge of the river here. It's still there today. The Mountain Tote Road, this cutoff was a little controversial one. They came in 1881. Happy Corner Road didn't appear until the turn of the century, 1903. And finally, in 1915, basically when logging ended, all these roads were done. Even though the Lincoln Pulp and Paper Company was in there for a few more years, it was basically done. This is the closest town to the river. It was called Davidson. a relatively small town, had 2 factories, several dorms, had a store. If you look at the picture in the lower left-hand corner, that's Main Street. It had wooden sidewalks. It was a rail town, and it was where many of the people that went to work in the forest would get off the train. It disappeared in 1931 for basically unknown reasons. A lot of conjecture there was not a church there. Some people feel that the payroll disappeared, but for whatever reason, it's no longer there. There's still 1 or 2 houses that have been moved out of there, but the area is basically just foundations. At the corner of the Swift Brook Road, which was the Stacyville Tote Road, there was a fairly large house, and it was owned by the Tracys. Foster Tracy built it, Madison Tracy and family. The Bullier family lived across the road, which was a descendant of the Tracy family. The foundation's still there. The cemetery's in the background. In 1906, to give you an idea of the importance of this was the edge of civilization as we knew it. But for the sportsmen, in 1906, they had the largest number of deer ever recorded in a fall hunt pass through this building. The picture was taken by Lucian Merrill on one of his 2 trips. Give you an idea of what the buildings look like. This is a 4-square structure. At the time, you could buy them from Sears and Roebuck. They came packaged, so it's a little bit different. This is the view of the Swift Brook Road at the turn of the century. I have pictures from 3 or 4 different years. And the funny thing is they all look the same. The Swift Brook Road got its name from the Emerson camps that were on Swift Brook at the bottom of the hill. There was a small town there with a sawmill. There are still foundations. But before that, it was simply called the Stacyville Tote Road. Back here. The Hunt Farm. This picture is a Lucian Merrill picture of the Hunt Farm as it was abandoned. Was where William Hunt lived and brought his family. It's built on a glacial delta. This was the edge of the ocean. What made it so special is the soil is incredibly rich. It was formed by a delta that flowed down off the east side mountains that are there. The first child born in the wilderness was born here in 1834. Lucian Merrill, as I said, traveled to this area in 1894 and again in 1892. This is what a ford was. This is the Hunt Ford, and for a long while I thought it was a specific location. And what the fords were simply areas where the water was relatively shallow in dry season. This is in front of what would be the Hunt Farm now. You can see the river's changed quite a bit. They would be standing on the far shore currently because that area is all filled in on the other side. But it's an area that's probably a half-mile long. It's part of a large glacial delta, which means that it's washed gravel. So when the horses went out and the wagons went out, it didn't sink through. It was well protected. There was another one just above the Wassataquoik, another one just below Lunxus. This was the house that replaced the Hunt Farm. It was built by a fellow named Simon Gates. He was a hotel owner from Wynn. He owned the Katahdin Hotel, which was a huge 3-story affair north of Bangor, and then bought the Mattawamkeag house, tried to buy the Madison house, and built this one. And what he wanted was a string of hotels that he could take his guests because he owned the stagecoach service for the area. There were 9 rooms in this one. It's kind of an interesting location. It never really amounted to anything because Lunxus built another road that took over the area. It was built in around early 1890. This is Lunxus, which was the other base of headquarters for logging up the Wassataquoik. It was a smaller camp that would be to the right of this one called Patterson Camp, eventually became known as the East Branch Camp. But Ayers and Rogers ran their lumbering operation, and when they sold out, they continued to use this as a sporting camp. It burned in 1908 for unknown reasons, but it's speculated that it was one of the more spectacular buildings, And part of it was that the walls on the inside were all made of birch bark, and they were all heated with wood stoves. They were lighted with candles and lanterns, and it's not really a wonder that the place burned. Anyway, in front of Lunksoos, to expedite things going across the river, they put in a cable ferry. The cable ferry operated from 1892 until 1922. The cable ferry was located at the end of what was called the Mountain Tote Road. It came from the Swift Brook or Stacyville Tote Road. And it started just downstream from present-day Lunksoos Landing. Present-day Lunksoos Landing is approximately this area right here. In the background, you can see a bateau and you can see another piece of another boat. But they were able to carry fully loaded wagons across. And the reason they built it, there was a small stream that entered at the end of the mountain road, and it left a very deep spot. So very quickly, it got deep enough so they could load the wagon and it would float. It was at 45 degrees to the river so that the current would help bring it across. This is moving upstream up the Wassataquoik. We're up through the wooded gorge on the edge of the Wassataquoik Tote Road. This is the first camp. It's known as the Reed Camp. It operated at a location called the Lower Katahdin Crossing, which was a place where they went as far up the river as they could until they ran into a moraine. That's where the glacier stood for a period of time and left a large pile of rocks. They couldn't cross it. They dropped back downstream until they hit a spot with hardly any boulders, a nice gravel bottom. This was a period of time when they were cutting tall pine. Unfortunately, because of that canyon that you saw in the beginning, they were able to remove none of the pine, so none of it made it to Bangor. When Hale and Channing did their 1845 trip to the top of Katahdin, their guides were from Mattawamkeag, part of the Reed crew. And as they were coming down, there were torrential rainstorms that filled the Wassataquoik, and they quickly gathered all the men they could to try to get some of the logs out, but still none of them made it to Bangor. This next gentleman in the center is George Witherley, great explorer. He made 11 trips between 1880 and 1901 into the Baxter region. He generally traveled with his daughter and his wife. There's Witherley Ravine on the northwestern side of Katahdin. He did explorations with a number of other scientists, but this is typically how the earlier people or explorers or scientists traveled. The man on the right was the person that would lead, kind of cleared the trail. He carried part of the load. The man on the left carried more of the load. And what they did is they took a large tarp, placed all the things in it, folded the tarp, and then put shoulder straps on it so that it could be carried. What did they carry it up? This is a piece of the Wassataquoik Tote Road. A lot of people wouldn't recognize that as a road, but they're able to travel with it, over it with wagons. They hiked over it. And you can still find that road all the way up into Russell Pond from almost the entrance where it enters the East Branch. And the reason you can is because what they did is they took the large boulders, moved them out to the edge. So the trail is about 8 to 10 feet wide most of the way, lined by boulders. And those boulders are still there today. In 1883, this road made it all the way to what was called New City. 1831, it made it only as far as Orin Falls. So there were two major moraines, or large places where the glacier ended, that they had to take time to reroute the road. Daisy Dam, kind of a strange name to a dam. There's Daisy Pond, DC Pond, all kinds of different names. This particular picture was taken by Lucian Merrill. And the way you can tell is this is his shakedown cabin here. This is the boom where they sorted the logs that came down through. They had two pylons to direct it. It was originally built in 1883. as one of 24 dams on the river. It was rebuilt and enlarged 4 times. It was placed at the entrance to that wooden gorge, that steep-sided wooden gorge that was pictured in the LiDAR picture. It had the largest sorting boom because it's a fairly large place to float logs. It had 4 gates. If you're not sure what a gate is, a gate was a way that men could lift up what blocked the river. And as they lifted it up using a fulcrum, it allowed water to flow through. And they typically had gates and a sluice that would hold the water at night when they weren't running. And then once they needed water, they'd head the logs down, shove them through the sluice, and then open it up and just keep forcing them. And they had men downstream trying to keep them straight. If you look at the bottom of their boots, they have caulks in all of them. Those are spikes. It gave them traction on the dam surface. The purpose was to always increase the flow and keep it like spring water the whole time. The dam, Daisy Dam, was a sorting place. The logs came in, they floated. This is a Daisy boom in 1884. The logs came in, they're long log spruce of all different lengths. And typically the cutters and the scalers would mark the ends of them so they know who they belong to, and they could get a good count before they sent it into the Penobscot, where there was a company that took care of it the rest of the way. In 1841, when the Rogers crew first reached Orin Falls, this is what they found. The logs or places were piled 50 feet high. These are all long logs. They're fairly large, and you can see that probably the men couldn't move them. What they had to do is they spent a tremendous amount of money. They were the first to use dynamite to clear things out, and they lost 6 men clearing the stream for the drive. The log jam, to clean up this log jam, they spent $4,000 to clean up the small stretch. Orin Falls was the first place where the moraine, a major moraine, was located. A lot of people look for a waterfall, which is just something sheer that goes over a ledge or something. But Orin Falls is just massive boulders. And if you look at Orin Falls today, you can still see rocks that were blasted because the pieces, if you're clever enough to look at them and find them and take some time, you can see the pieces fit together. They also had a wooden boom that allowed the logs to be directed down through. The next place we run into, this is the sandbank clearing. I only have a fairly good idea where this camp was, so that's my next place to explore to see if I can find anything from this camp. The camp was built by Edward Draper. It's not too far from what's known as Lynx Pond. Downstream, there was a dam there, and it was a cutting. The Sandbank Trail, or road, crosses right where Sandbank Campground is. It was built by Madison Tracy to Katahdin Lake during a period of time when they felt that Mount Katahdin in the area would become either a national park, a national forest, or a state park, and that Stacyville wanted to be the major access to it. Great Northern wasn't particularly happy about that, so there were some big battles, and their cutting crews continually removed the logs or placed the logs to block the trail. The next place we run into is at Katahdin Lake. This is a picture of, in 1897, of Katahdin Lake camps looking at the Great Basin. It was built in 1884 by Madison Tracy and a guy named John Cushman. In 1900, Madison, who wanted to move on to other things, bigger and better things, sold out to Cushman for $100. Cushman's brother, Joe, had the operation at the outlet that built the dam there, and he also had built a lumber camp there. At the outlet of Katahdin Lake, there was a major dam, and that dam is probably one of the best preserved that there is in the watershed. It was part of the turnpike supposed to be part of the turnpike to the top of Katahdin in 1856. In March 28th of 1859, Bodie Shepherd, got land on the far end of the lake to build a major hotel. Marcus Keep, on February 19th, the same year, was granted a lot for all the work that he did cutting the Keep Trail. And what happened was the great turnpike to the top of Katahdin that was planned in 1856 never materialized. So neither of the camps ever became a factor. Shepherd sold his land to the Ross Company, and Marcus Keep built a small cabin where Joseph Cushman had been logging. Edward Draper took the camp at the north end of the lake and blasted the stream in 1912, rebuilt the dam, and drove pulp down it. Oh, sorry. This is a picture of a wagon, and the wagon's going on what would become known as the Appalachian Trail. Appalachian Trail was cleared by a gentleman named Clarence Peavy in 1886. It was the original Appalachian Trail. It traveled from the upper crossing, Katahdin Crossing, to Katahdin Lake, and then onto the Great Basin. It was cut for an Appalachian Mountain Club retreat. Next place we have going upstream is Robar. Robar Dam was kind of an interesting place. Robar Dam was built in 1883 by Tracy and Love. It was named for Isaiah Robar. He lived there with his dog, Kelly. He'd been booted out of Patterson Place, or where Lunksoos was, by Rogers, and Rogers gave him a job as a cook in his camp. And he was a good cook, he worked hard, so he gave him some land. He built a cabin there, and he was well known for telling stories. The leather stocking tales was his favorite, and he would retell stories, and anybody that came to visit, even though he was kind of a hermit, knew that they were more than welcome to stay with him. In later years, in the 1920s and 30s, this became the location where Madison Tracy came from Little Spring Brook across the mountains and then headed up the Wassataquoik Tote Road to Madison camps, or Tracy camps at Russell Pond. Going upstream, the next place we run into, this is the dam on the right at Twin Ponds. Twin Ponds are high on the mountain on North Turner, inside of Baxter. The stream flows into the Wassataquoik. They cut pulp up in here during a period of 1912 and 1913. They used that dam. They had a major lumber camp between the two ponds. Still pieces or remnants of it, the stove and barrel staves and so forth. But what they did is basically they clear cut the side of Turner Mountain and shipped it down. Going upstream, the next place we run into is Old City. Old City was a major depot. It was one of two spots on the Wassataquoik that were conducive to having a large depot. A large depot was a place where lumbermen could ship supplies and they could live. This is the river crew that lived there. One of the river crews that operated out of there. This is the town of Old City. And Old City burned in the 1884 fire, burned in the 1903 fire, but in between, there were a couple buildings that were still left after the first fire. It was a single storehouse and a camp that remained. So they turned one of the camps into a hotel, 2 stories. The hotel wasn't a particularly a great success because this town was built for lumbermen by lumbermen, and bringing in guests in the summer who were sports or fishing to live in the same place that the lumbermen lived in all winter wasn't the kind of accommodations that were desired by the visitors. So typically sporting camps started to rise after this. The camps that remained, once they abandoned this place, were open for anybody to take. And that was often where families moved in who didn't have a place to live in the woods, to trap and whatever. This is a jump sled, one of those camps that people have taken over. Jump sled was basically a sled that was used in the winter to haul small loads of logs. And they put all their supplies, and you can see the family has come to this place to move in. It gave them a home, a place to make a living. Sometimes they'd live there year round. Sometimes they only lived in the winter. Sometimes they only lived in the summer, depending on what they wanted to do. These folks trapped, hunted, fished, and basically subsisted off the land. The next
Eric,
place, yeah.
Just a quick question from in the chat box. Is there anything remaining of Old City?
Other than artifacts, no. It was burned flat in the fire at the turn of the century. It was left open as a large field. If you look at aerial photographs from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you can see that the field got smaller and smaller and smaller, and basically there's nothing there. But in its heyday, there were over a dozen buildings, had a schoolhouse, blacksmith shop. They had, as I said, a hotel there. But after it burned, there was nothing left, and they never rebuilt it after it burned the second time.
Okay. They asked if they had tried to locate a trail past Grand Falls to find Old City, but they didn't find a way there.
Old City was on the, let me go back here a sec. Old City, if you look at the map in the corner, the aerial photographs show it on this side here. The descriptions are right here and right here. So the aerial photographs show the old field being about where the A is, just below the mouth of Pogie Brook. But other than that, that's about the best you can do. There are aerial photographs from the 1950s that people can still look at. I was looking at Pogie Camp at the old photographs yesterday, and you can still see. But this is what it was like. This picture was taken in 1905. I have written down, but so basically the buildings were gone, started to grow back. You can see the tall timber that's burned in the background. The road goes right through it. Next place we run into is what was called Mammoth Dam. And inscribed on the rock, this was a picture taken by Avery. It was the operation, if you look at the spelling of the Wassataquoik, a part of the problem that people have, whether it's Daisy, DC, Tracy, Stacyville or Stacyville, the spellings are vastly different. And the reason they are is because the level of education of some of the folks back then really wasn't the best. So you'll find multiple spellings for things, which generally accounts for the different names on maps. Once the Geographic Society got involved, names started to be standardized on the larger objects first, and finally the smaller objects like lakes and ponds and streams. But today there are still many, many names that are controversial. But this shows at the start, they started logging on October 16th, 1883. Winter logging was the way that they worked, not summer logging. Same rock, Mammoth Dam in the background. Mammoth Dam is an enormous dam, or was an enormous dam. From the dam itself, it's said that you could see 5 other dams, 2 above and 2 below. They were built in 1883 to kind of get them through a fairly steep section of river. This is the boom above Mammoth Dam. The boom was because when they backed the water up, it was relatively flat, filled with boulders. And so the men had to have something that they could walk out on and keep the logs being pushed. The other interesting thing here is you can see in the background many of the burned trees. Today, They're becoming fewer and fewer, but you can still wander through the woods and find these large trees. The large trees are there basically because when they burned so hot and so quick that all organic material was basically, anything that was living in it was destroyed. So basically, it has to be reorganized by something that will destroy it. And it just takes a lot of time to do that. So once again, it's the largest dam in the system of the 24 dams. There were many, many dams that were small that they didn't count in the 24. Some of them as small as a single log used to cross a stream or hold a little bit of water back. This is Russell Camp. Russell Camp was at the location of Russell Pond, the mouth. It was a 1883 camp. The interesting thing here is one of my favorite pictures. The men in the center are holding caribou antlers. The men, when they moved into the valley, discovered caribou, and they realized if they shot a caribou, that the other caribou would come and circle around it. It was easy for them to shoot a whole bunch of them, which is what they did, and it gave them fresh meat for the whole winter. The problem with that was that it decimated the herd, and as you know, we have no caribou any longer. But basically, the camps were flooded badly in 1901 and abandoned. Rogers, who came in from, Rogers had been logging in the 1850s on Trout Brook, came in here because he was one of the few that could operate on boulder streams. New City, a little further upstream, which was at the mouth of, well, it's on the Wassataquoik, not far from the Russell Stream. This is an 1892 picture of New City. New City was a major depot for supplies going further into the valley. The object was to cut all the tall spruce that there was in there. Once they had the fire, they went back again to salvage as much wood as they could during the winter before the insects and worms got to it in the spring. Edward Draper, when he had New City, because this was shortly after the fire, built a fire lookout on the top of a small mountain to the northwest, or basically north of Russell Pond, New City. It was high enough so it could watch the valley and protect it from fires. This is a picture that Draper used in his Christmas card. And that's the only way that it's really survived. But it was one of the first deep in Baxter fire lookouts. The next dam we run into, or next place we run into, was built in 1892. It was the Bell Dam on the South Branch. A road was constructed in 1892 by Rogers up to this location. Madison Tracy used this location as a way to bring his guests in. And what he did is every spring, before he'd bring his guests in, he'd take his animals down and he'd rearrange the rocks so they could walk from rock to rock to rock without getting their feet wet across this stream. A little something special for his guests. Bell camps.
Hey, Eric,
Hello?
one more question for you.
Yep.
Before you move too far past the fire lookout.
Yep.
Was the fire lookout on what is now known as the Caverly Lookout? Am I saying that right? Caverly?
Yep. Yep. It was only used for 2 years.
Okay.
I could find no remnants of it, but that doesn't mean anything. And this is Bell Camp, Ayers and Rogers Camp that they built. This is what it looked like in 1894 when Merrill traveled it. A little further upstream was McLeod Camp. It was built 2 miles further upstream. And what they did is they took 3 streams, joined them together with dams so they could have enough water to flush logs down through. This camp here is the Mullen Brook Camp. Mullen Brook Camp was above Turner Deadwater, deep in the mountains. It was built had a dam, had a sluice into the pond. In 1910, this gives you an idea of what the camps looked like. All camps that were built by Edward Draper had standardized construction. If you look at some of the old Great Northern plans, they had a set of plans that they went by these, and all the camps from this point forward when Draper were there looked identical. Windows in the same place, doors in the same place. The sluice, if it was above this, that came off Mullen Mountain, was built by Frank Annis. Moving up the mountains, this is Pogie, a Pogie camp. Pogie camp was built up on the top of Pogie Mountain, kind of a unique place. And one of the better things known about it is it's still there, but not anything I'd ever want to drink out of. But this was an old well. It was a welcome place for travelers. Draper was getting so far into the valley at this point that he started to look at Trout Brook and access from Trout Brook. So this was kind of an intermediate place built up on a mountain. It was a depot, which meant it had supplies and supplies camps in many other places. Number of buildings, blacksmith shop, they had storehouses there, they had buildings for men. And here you can see that visitors even used the place. The well became the feature, and it was identified on maps as the old well. The yard, go back here. The yard, pretty typical of the camp. If you look around the camp, the front of the camp there, the interesting thing there, all the different sized barrels. Each barrel represented some different kind of food that was brought in, whether it was pork or pickled beef or molasses or whatever. They had limited supplies. All the supplies came in the fall and typically stayed all year. If you look at the side of the house, you can see it's covered with icicles. And those icicles are due to lack of insulation. So they weren't the most pleasant places to stay in the world. This is at Pogie. One of the things they did at Pogie, you can see here a couple of things. Number one, if you look in the center of the picture, you can see pulp piled. Above the pulp, you can see long logs, and they've all been peeled. What they did is they built this ramp out over the cliffs of Pogie Mountain so they could build a sluiceway for the logs to go down to the lake. The sluiceway was built such that horses had to bring the logs out on this ramp that was hanging out over the edge of the cliff. So imagine the training that those animals must have had to get out there. Once they get out there, it was what's called a cut-up mill. A cut-up mill was a place where they took the long logs that had been peeled. They were peeled because they're greater value. They got more money if they were peeled than if they weren't peeled. Cut them up into 4-foot pieces. When they cut them up into 4-foot pieces, they sent them down a sluice. This is a picture of the sluice that they had. It was 1,600 feet long, and it was the only sluice that they had that had metal in it. At the bottom was ironclad because it was about 50 feet above the water, about 25 feet back on the edge of the cliff. And the logs would be shot down this and come out with such a force that they would sometimes shoot 150 to 200 feet out in the lake. The first sluice was built on the east slope of the mountain. This one happens to be on the south slope of the mountain. The sluice itself was not covered, and things were so violent that most of the pulp didn't make it because it was going too fast. So what they did is they put a cover on the sluice so that the logs ran down underneath. One of the issues there was a Russian logger that was inside working on it, and they didn't realize it, and they sent some pulp down through, and he was one of the people that were killed in the use of this. When it hit the lake, you can see how far back it is. You can see that it's flipped, and you can see in the center here, right here, a piece of pulp. That's something that's 18 inches wide, 4 feet long, several hundred pounds comes shooting out the end of that thing. And it would land in the lake and then floated down the lake. They worked the lake with what was called a bateau. The bateau was a standard boat built by Maynard out of Bangor. He built most of them. To get it up there, what they had to do, because it's steep terrain getting up in there, they had the horses put the bateau on a log sled, and then they dragged it up. Getting the logs down off the mountain, there are several places that are called snub pitch. This happens to be snub pitch on Pogie Mountain, but there's one by Basin Ponds. A snub pitch was a place where the road was so steep that the horses couldn't pull the logs down. So what they did is they hooked a rope or steel cable to the back of the load and then wrapped it around a tree and lowered it very, very slowly. You can imagine the amount of friction there was. And in this case, middle of the winter, the tree caught fire. What they did was they also on Pogie had a mechanical snub machine. If you look at the two handles that the man has, what he did was he moved them back and forth, and there were brakes. It was to a rock or the ledge or something, and one lever would operate two wheels, and the other lever would operate the odd wheels. So what that did is never really let it heat up and could allow something to go down, a horse to pull something down that was as steep as 45 degrees. The problem with these snub lines and so forth, there were some terrible accidents associated with them. If the cable broke or the rope broke and the horses were pulling a heavy load down, the horses oftentimes would not make it. This is the cut-up mill. You can see where the sluice was in the background. The cut-up mill was on the east end of Wassataquoik Lake, not too far from the outlet. And what it was a place that they took long logs, cut them up into 4-foot sections, then dumped them on the lake to be driven out in the spring. Another interesting one is this one here. They needed more water in Little Wassataquoik Lake. They had a set of camps in Little Wassataquoik Lake, and Madison Tracy had his home there. They needed more water, so what they did is they built a canal and a dam that took the water from Hathorn Brook, flowing into Trout Brook, and diverted it into Little Wassataquoik Lake. And what that did is they gave them enough water to drive the little stream that comes out of Little Wassataquoik Lake. And if you've ever been there and looked at that stream, you would recognize the fact that there's hardly any water in it. This is the Little Wassataquoik Lake camps. You can see the Edward Draper standard construction, the windows, the doors, built deep in the valley. They built it with wood that was on hand, that was valuable to use. It said Madison Tracy at his family home there. This is a picture of Madison Tracy's family, his home, with the deer, several deer there for food. You can see the whole family was in there. This is Mountain Camp. George Annis was the boss. It was built on Annis Brook. It has a sluice from the brothers in 1911 and 1912. This is a picture of the camps. There are two of them there, standard Draper construction. This is Mountain Dam. Mountain Dam was one that averaged every 2 years having to be completely rebuilt. It was in such rugged terrain. There's still quite a few artifacts left from the dam and the camps that were there. Another camp that there was on Tip Top Mountain. It's the highest one. Talked to a gentleman, said his grandfather took him in there when he was a little kid, but most people have a difficult time finding. Madison Tracy was rumored to have ridden a horse to the top of Katahdin from here. It's not very far from the tree line. Whether he did or not, or whether he just reached the edge of the tree line, really there's no verification of it. This is the sluice over Tip Top. The sluice was a shorter one. Believe it or not, there's a small brook down there. That small brook, they took this pile of pulp and drove it down the small brook. You can see it's a fairly sizable pile in what looks like a fairly dry valley. to find the camp, use things like this valley here that's still there to find where it was. This is as far up in the basins as they went. You can see that they're not very far from Davis Pond. You can see Harvey Ridge in the background, but they cut as far as they could up in the valley and cut as much as they could. The next place we have McCartney camps. When they gave up Old City, New City, the McCartney camp became the depot of choice. This is far up on the Trout Brook. It was a crossover place, and Trout Brook would have been the next place downstream. Trout Brook Farm was used for a long time. This is a picture of Trout Brook Farm in some of the houses. Great Northern used it for storage. Baxter used it for storage for a few years. This is another place. They drove the pulp into the east branch of the Penobscot, and you can see the massive pile that there is at the top, and you can see the village. This is the town of Grindstone. It's not on the side that Route 11's on, it's on the other side of the river. And what it was is they took all the pulp that was coming down the east branch of the Penobscot, pulled it out of the river here, shipped it by rail to Dolby so that East Millinocket could have it for the mill. So all this wood was destined for the mill. When Edward Draper left the valley in 1914, he made the statement that there was not a bit of standing timber left anywhere in the valley. He sold it, or they sold it, Katahdin Pulp and Paper sold it to Lincoln Pulpwood Company. And what they did is they cleared a little bit off the top of Pogie's, but due to fire and flooding, they gave up fairly quickly. To give you some of the idea of some of the roads here that were here, I'll go through them real quickly. Road A in the lower right-hand corner is Stacyville Road, 1831. The next one, B, which is kind of in the center, is the Wassataquoik Tote Road. C is the Keep Path, that kind of peach-colored thing. Katahdin Tote Road, 1874, is D. Lang and Jones Road and Trail, 1874. Sandy Stream Tote Road, which is F. Then we have the Appalachian Trail, 1887. Appalachian Trail is G. H is the Telos Tote Road, now commonly known as the Old Tote Road or Old Road. I, in the bottom there, is the Sandbank Trail. J is Robar that William Tracy and Madison Tracy used to bring people into Russell Pond. And K, the one at the top, is the Happy Corner Road. So now I guess we have a few minutes. As I look, we have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them for you. If not.
Thank you, Eric. Wonderful. We had some pop up in the middle there now, so we may have answered the questions. I was curious. Oh, hold on. We've got one before mine. Did they run logs through Grand Falls?
They did. They ran it two ways. They carted it through there. Carting is when you put logs crisscross across the stream and slide logs over the top. That's what they did with long logs. And once they got to pulp, they simply flushed it down through. They did some blasting there, not real extensive because there weren't as many huge boulders as there were ledge. But yes, they ran logs down through, they drove them down through there. And that was one of the problems. One of the reasons they have Old City's location where it is because all the river drivers had to spend so much time there picking the end. Picking the end was where they removed the logs from the edges and forced them downstream as the water dissipated.
Great. Well, while we're waiting for some more questions, I just want to note that if anyone wants to follow what Friends of Katahdin Woods and Waters is doing, you can find more information on the website, friendsofkww.org. You can also find Friends of Katahdin Woods and Waters on Facebook, and you can become a member through either one of those. I want to thank Eric for hosting this again today, or Millinocket Memorial Library for hosting us and Eric for presenting. And thank you all for joining us. We still have a couple of minutes left for questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep talking like this. No.
Edmund Ware Smith said it was probably the most violent and destructive of all the logging. And the fact is simply the fact that Edward Draper said that there was nothing standing in the valley when he left is kind of a testament how quickly things on the East Coast grow back. Because today, if you go to Wassataquoik Valley, most of those things are gone. I can remember as a kid going into Old City, New City, and being able to see farm equipment. And as a little kid going into New City, I remember a giant patch of rhubarb right in the middle of the field. And those things aren't even fields anymore. So things disappear quickly, as do the cabins and other things.
Yeah. Now, Eric, when he said there was nothing left there, was he just stating a fact, or was he kind of bragging that they had accomplished so much?
Well, he was the president of Katahdin Pulp and Paper, which was, is Great Northern eventually. And you've seen KP Dam and some places like that. But basically, when he became president, he got the company to switch from long logs to pulp. And the reason they wanted to switch to pulp was because the mills, when they appeared, East Millinocket, Millinocket. Millinocket was the largest paper producer in the world the year it opened. And East Millinocket was the second largest. So that'll give you an idea how much wood they needed to consume. And so with his switch to pulp and having the loggers peel the bark in the woods and leave it, kind of promoted the mill. So he was in a way bragging, but it was the last watershed to be cut. And probably if there were wood other places, they wouldn't have cut it, but they cut all around it 20 to 40 years earlier. And it was really the only place that was left that had a large amount of tall spruce that was good quality. And the reason that spruce was such good quality is because it was cold there, and the trees grew more slowly. So the fibers in the spruce were longer, and it made a better quality of paper, which kind of led to Millinocket's name, the Magic City, as it appeared out of nothing.
Wow, great. Wonderful. Thanks again. Now, Eric, your book is still coming out this summer, or unless you've heard something else, correct?
Covert does what it does. So it's supposed to come out the first week of July, but I guess time will tell.
Great.
I'm just like everybody else, tired of being cooped up.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. It's nice to see familiar names and faces on the screen, and we will be posting more events as they happen through partnership with the Millinocket Memorial Library. Have a great evening.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
We'll see you.
Bye.